Thank you. Always a privilege to stand in this House and an honour to speak on behalf of Ontarians and also those wonderful people from Parkdale High Park. I want to start because when people tell you you're going to be debating the budget and you're going to be speaking about the budget, there is a tendency for eyes to glaze over on the viewing public. I want you to stay tuned, though, because I'm going to attempt to actually make this debate entertaining in some small measure. I'm not going to tell any jokes. A member from Davenport suggested. No, there are no jokes, unfortunately. It's far from a laughing matter. But I do want to tell some stories. And the first one is this. At a conference that I attended of state legislators and also members of provincial parliament from across Canada in the States, there was a keynote speech. And the keynote speech was by a governor, I won't mention the name, I in fact don't remember his name, who was retiring from his role as governor in Pennsylvania, a Democrat. And he said, I'm retiring, Mr. Speaker, he said, so now I can tell the truth. He said, I don't have to bow to any pressures. I'm out of here. So here's what we need to do. Here's what we need to do in the United States. He said, not just in the state of Pennsylvania, but here's what we need to do in the entire United States. We need a Medicare system like the Canadian one. He said, single-payer Medicare system. He said, we need to put more money into education and more money into infrastructure. Absolutely. And he said, and to pay for all of that, he said, we need to roll back the $900 billion of tax cuts to the wealthy and corporations brought in by Bush alone, $900 billion, and this number is staggering, but it's true, $1.6 trillion in corporate and wealthy tax cuts since the Reagan era. And then he said, with a note of sadness in his voice, and we're not going to do any of the above. So, sayonara, he said, off the stage. That was it. One of the better political speeches I've ever heard. So if you hold that image in your mind, you get at some of what we're facing here. And it's a problem, right? It's a problem because even when it comes to what seems paltry in comparison to those figures of the $1.3 billion we've been asking for, that we don't want to be spent, a gift to corporations, as it were, to be able to write their HST off of their entertainment expenses. We find out late in the game, Mr. Speaker, well after we've had this as one of our asks on the table in the New Democratic Party, that lo and behold, it obviously wasn't taken very seriously or seems to have slipped the Minister of Finance's mind. But, in days before the budget is tabled, he writes a letter to the federal finance minister asking to negotiate around this. I mean, our critic, Peggy Nash, who's the MP in my riding of Parkdale High Park, actually stood up and asked a question on this topic in the House, and the response that she got was no. No, we're not. We're not going to renegotiate. But, I mean, to leave it, first of all, that late in the game, second of all, to pay it such small heed as to treat it that way, and thirdly, to absolve, of course, the responsibility this provincial government has around revenue sources is very strange, I have to say, very strange indeed. There are some other notes around here that goes to the former governor of Pennsylvania's problems with his own government. For example, in this budget, we see that corporate taxes are going down again, and I just pointed out how. From about $11 billion as a revenue stream to about $10 billion. On the other hand, where is the new money coming from? We see income taxes going up about $4 billion. They're going up about $4 billion, from 26 to about $30 billion. One wonders why. How? Who's going to pay these extra income taxes? Not really spelled out in this budget, kind of a question mark. The assumption being, and is somewhat fleshed out, well, we're going to be growing, we're going to be earning more, we're going to somehow make these targets. I would say a red flag, Mr. Speaker, a suspicious red flag there. Because really, if you look at the history of corporate taxation in this province, by the way, one of the lowest corporate tax bases in the Western world, far lower, my friends, than the Americans, far lower than the Americans. Now, our friends to the right here and our friends who pretend they're not to the right across the aisle would say, well, this is how you create jobs. What you do is you pour the money in at the top to the wealthy and to the large corporations. Somehow it's going to trickle down into jobs. But the reality is it hasn't. It never has, it never will, and it hasn't. About 86 billion in Canadian dollars have been spent on that theory, have ended up in banks, just stashed away by those very same corporations and wealthy individuals who didn't use the money to create jobs, who didn't invest in infrastructure, who didn't invest in education, who didn't invest in machinery or creating jobs of any sort. They just have it sitting there. So it didn't work. I always love the tax and spend expression when it's applied to us, of course, or to the Liberals, or my friends to the right of us here, because that's, what government doesn't tax and spend? Every government taxes and spends. The only question is this: who do you tax and who do you spend the money on? And I would warn that the Liberals and Conservatives have something in common here. That clearly from this document and clearly from words from my friends in the Progressive Conservative Party's mouths, that what they would like to do is to spend it on the corporations and wealthy individuals and tax the middle class and those below, by both directly and also by the way of cutting social services. That's a different kind of tax, right? So what we in the New Democratic Party have said as part of our DNA always as Social Democrats is what we think you should do is, of course, tax more progressively and fairly, that corporations and wealthy individuals should pay their fair share, and that money should fairly be spent on social services where it's needed, that actually generates wealth. And by the way, Mr. Speaker, it's been proven around the world to do just that. That kind of progressive economic thinking, not the thinking of bookkeeping, but progressive economic thinking, which, by the way, is progressive business thinking too. I used to be in business. Business works this way too. You invest money first. You invest money first, and then you see the profits come out after. You don't slash and burn and somehow expect to make money. It doesn't work that way anywhere, and it doesn't work that way in government either. And we are now dealing with a province that spends less on social services per capita than anyone else in Canada. So clearly, the Liberal government has a lot in common with the Progressive Conservatives. In fact, we like to say on this side that they're Conservatives in a hurry. That's what's happening over there. What else can we say about taxing corporations and wealthy individuals fairly so that others are not unfairly taxed? I know a member over here, when he was speaking about this budget, brought up the spectre of Greece. Greece is a popular spectre to bring up in these circles and in these discussions, but it's always done ill-advisedly, because, in fact, the problem of austerity budgets in Greece is what caused the problem. It wasn't social democracy or socialism in Greece. It was a conservative government, time and time again, who slashed and burned, that created the problem that Greece had. So if you're going to compare us to Greece, then please, that's comparing one conservative government against possibly another. So again, what we proved, and I think we proved this, we in the New Democratic Party in the last budget go-around, was that there is an appetite among Ontarians for fairness. Fairness in taxation, fairness in revenue tools. We proved that with one of, I think, the best things that we've done, and that is to push this government, across the aisle, Liberal government, into a wealth tax. Now, it was more symbolic than actual. I'll give you that, Mr. Speaker. It wasn't a lot of money that was generated by that, but it polled at 78%. 78% of Ontarians thought that somebody making over $500,000 a year could afford to pay just a little bit more to keep what we value as Ontarians going. You know, this isn't rocket science. Even I spoke, and I remember, I'll share a story, another story. I met a broker at a function I went to. He made $500,000 a year. He came up to me in the last budget go-around, and I expected to be criticized because he was one of the ones we wanted to levy that tax on. And he said, you know, he said he didn't complain about it. He said, you know where you should really go after? He said, some of my clients who are getting away with sending their money south to the Cayman Islands, other places, you should go after them. That's what the broker said, who made $500,000 a year. So there is clearly an appetite for fairness there. Now, I've already spent some of the time, I want to spend the other time on the other part of the equation, and that's where the money is going. Because I had a very poignant call from a constituent who's on ODSP, and he wanted to know what was in the budget for him. And I explained to him, you know, you could keep, you know, instead of being clawed back the $200 you make, you can keep the whole $200. And he said, but I'm disabled and I can't work. And then I said, well, okay, so you get a 1% increase on your disability check. And he said, my rent went up 2.5% last year. Now, that to me is, you know I'm not alone in this, but one of the reasons I ran for political office, one of the reasons I have the privilege of standing here today is because of the issues of poverty. And I have to say that if this is a social justice premier, and this is supposedly a social justice budget, then it's sadly lacking when at the end of the day, those who are most marginalized in our community are actually worse off than they were under Mike Harris. And that is the reality. That is the reality. They are worse off. Now, did we put forward minimal demands in order to work with the government to get something done? Did we want the bar pushed ahead a little bit? Yes, we got that, Mr. Speaker, we got that. But this, I remind everyone, is a Liberal budget. It is not a New Democratic Party budget. And as such, it does a very Liberal thing. It does the least required of it where the marginalized are concerned, and it does more than was ever asked where the wealthy and large corporations are concerned. So that's really what we see. Is there anything about community startup in this budget? No, there is not, sadly, even though those who work in the anti-poverty area would have liked to have seen that come back. Is there anything, even a mention about housing, when we have the worst per capita investment in housing of any province across Canada? No, not one word about housing, unfortunately. Are there some good things? Yes. But let me put this forward, Mr. Speaker, that we really have to shift our thinking. Poverty actually costs us money. It costs us, in fact, and this is proven, about $10 billion a year. And on another fall, I want to use the example of Quebec, because when you look at Quebec and their investment, for example, in childcare, where you could get childcare at $7, I think it's $10 a day now, they put the money in, just like the example of priming the pump for corporations. You invest and you expect the return. They did that with childcare in Quebec. They invested heavily in childcare so that folk who needed it could have it. And guess what? After a number of years, it not only pays for itself, it makes the money. It makes $1.05 to every dollar they invested in subsidized childcare in Quebec. That's true economy. That's how good business thinks. You invest and you get a return on your investment. That's what they did. And if we invested in trying to eradicate poverty to the degree that the situation calls for it, we would in fact not only save money, we would make money in our budget. For example, poverty costs about $2.9 billion in healthcare costs. Child poverty costs between about $1.3 to $1.6 billion. You know, locking people up, the justice system, a lot of the social determinants of health, and a lot of folk who end up on the street end up using the justice system, that is around another billion. I mean, productivity costs alone make up the balance. When you have people living and dying on the street, you are wasting not only human potential, you are wasting economic potential as well. And that's the way an economist thinks. It's even the way some business leaders are coming around to thinking on the issue of poverty. But we don't see that reflected here. Another story. I remember, Mr. Speaker, when I used to be the housing critic, and I sat when John Gerritsen, who is now Attorney General, was then the Minister in charge of Housing and Municipal Affairs. And there he was on government agencies, and we showed him the figures to prove that it costs over $100 a night to keep somebody in a shelter. What, you say? What kind of economy would pay that money to keep somebody in a shelter? For $100 a night, there are some motels I could direct you to, where you get a night in a motel. But that is what poverty means. Poverty is a skewed way of looking at the economy. So why is this government not investing in housing, knowing it costs so much to keep people homeless? It costs money to keep people poor. It costs money to keep people homeless. It costs money to keep children in poverty. This costs us in real dollars. So where is the political will to really tackle these issues? I don't see it. I don't see it here. I see some steps forward, yes, minimal steps forward, but certainly not enough to see the return on investment that one would expect. The kind of return on investment that I've just described happens in Quebec, where $1 into childcare gets $1.05 back. Just you have to put the dollar in first, just like business. You put money in, you get profits out. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I'm running out of time. I just want to use an example again of Sweden, where again my husband and I travel and talk to people. And here is a community of 9 million people. We have 13 million odd in Ontario. Somehow in Sweden they managed to do things we can only dream about. Somehow in Sweden they managed to have free post-secondary. Somehow in Sweden they managed to have eradicated poverty for all intents and purposes. Somehow in Sweden they managed to have a minimum wage well over $13 an hour and a unionized McDonald's to boot, and an 85% unionization rate, by the way. And at the same time, by the way, dental, pharmacare, all of those programs that we wish in our dreams we could have here in Canada or in Ontario. And at the same time, they have an incredibly vibrant economy. They have Sony Ericsson, they have IKEA, they have Volvo. We could name a number of Swedish companies. They're doing very well, thank you very much. They're essentially baking a bigger pie and dividing it up more fairly. So ultimately, as we move forward in the budget process, and ultimately when we move forward to the point where I think an NDP budget could actually be tabled when we're government, we'll be looking at issues like that. For now, enough to say on two fronts. Number one, on revenue streams, there's some discussion to be had. In light of the Pennsylvania governor's story, do we, any of us here, really want to walk away from this chamber and said we should have, we could have, and we didn't? So revenue streams, should the wealthy not pay their fair share? Should corporations not pay their fair share? It's a question. And on the other side, the poor gentleman on ODSP, for whom $2 doesn't mean much because he can't work, and for whom a 1% raise doesn't mean much because his rent just went up by 2.5%, we have to answer to him too. And we have to answer to all of those like him, all those children and women and men in our community who barely get by, who are doing worse now than they ever did under Mike Harris and his drastic and draconian cuts, and who we need to answer for, both ethically and economically, because not only would money invested in their lives pay back easily $1.05 on a dollar, but because it's the right thing to do. Just very simply, it's the right thing to do. So I'm almost out of time. Suffice to say, I didn't get time to talk about just holding the government's feet to the fire on their promises, because that's another piece of it, and that's why we propose a Financial Accountability Office, which is nothing novel, Mr. Speaker. This is what the feds have been doing for a while. We just want what they have here. And I think in light of the gas plants, e-health and Orange, it's the very least we can ask for. And in light of the promises, such as they are, that are made in this budget, it's the very least we could ask for too. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to let others have a kick at this can. And all I can say is to the person on ODSP, the governor in Pennsylvania, you didn't see the American reality he wanted to see. We're working on it. We pushed the bar a little bit, but boy, we got a long way to go. Thanks very much.